You remember I sent the short block down to the shop there, and they're going to disassemble it, and they're going to bore this thing out 30 over. And while I was down there, they talked me into assembling the short block, and it just ends up saving me a bunch of time, because on the weekends, you know, it'd probably take me 4 weekends to assemble this in my spare time, so they just get me ahead of the game. Now, when I took it down there and they bored it out, and I took them my pistons there, as you recall, the whole objective here is to increase the compression, and so now we've got this piston is practically zero with the deck here, whereas I do believe when we started this off, the factory pistons were about 50 thou deep. So that was the main part here, was compression, camshaft. The carburetor will be the last piece. Those were the three factors for this build. When they were going to assemble this thing, it crossed my mind after we were talking about balancing there, that because I was changing these pistons here, I need these pistons balanced to the rotating assembly. And as it turned out, they measured the new pistons and the old pistons, and I do believe they told me there was something like 100 grams difference between the two. And I think, if I'm correct, these are actually lighter than the factory ones. And the reason that they're so much lighter, I guess, is more for the pin rather than the piston itself. So I think most of the weight was in the pins. So they balanced the rotating assembly, and I had to take on my harmonic balancer here, and he told me when I got it back, so he drilled this hole in here. I think factory there's no material removed, but he drilled this hole in here to neutral balance this. And he also told me too that I should be looking at getting a new one, because if you can see, the rubber is deteriorating in there. And this is the spot that he says is the worry. That's not good. So basically, he said it'll, you know, I'll be all right, but I should be changing this out, and I shouldn't have to worry either, because these are a neutral balance harmonic balancer, so it's not like I'll have to get this balanced with the rotating assembly in the future. When I took the rotating assembly down to him, I took him both the shiv, the harmonic balancer, the flex plate on the back here. Had to give him the bolts for the flex plate, crank, and then all the pistons, rods, stuff like that, so that he could do his job there. When I took the rotating assembly down there, here's the information. So it looks like he's measuring each rod and each piston, and he's calculating all those weights, and this was the information for those weights. So it's showing us here that the initial run up on the left side and right side, and he's got some weights there, and he's got some RPM. So for example, 44.54 on the left side at 1,000 RPM is equal to 9.43 inch-pounds. You do that same weight at 10,000 RPM and you're getting 943.09 inch-pounds right there. So he's got left side and right side. If we go over to the engine here, I think that this is our right side, just basically because it's got the R on there. I could be totally wrong, but so right side, and then the left side over here. If we take a look, here's where our holes are, and that's where it looks like here is where he was drilling holes to remove material to balance this thing out. And then if we spin this thing over, we can see again it's the same thing back here, where looks like here is where some material's been removed. I don't know, maybe in these as well, if those are just factory, but those are the spots where the material's been removed to balance this thing out. And then if you can notice here, This is where those rods were. He had to equal the weight out in the rods. So this is the large end. So he would have this on the belt sander, and he's removing material off of this end here. We can't see on the piston side, but it'll be on the very top of the rod inside where the piston is. That'll be the spot they're removing material for the small end. So small end is the piston, the large end is for the crankshaft. Again, he's got some information here for when he was doing the balance. And then if we take a look at the bottom, what we're looking at here is the same left and right side, and the weight has been reduced from 44.54 to 1.25. And on this side here, initially it was 47.06, and now we're at 1.19. And here, so we're probably going to be running this engine around 4,000. I can't see it being any higher than that. So this is what our rotational force is going to be, less than. And even if we did ever get it up to 6 grand, we're still less than 10 inch-pounds of force. Anyone wanting to know the cam that I selected for this build, here's the information on that. There's a lot of information that goes with the camshaft, so I'm just simply going to show you the cam card here. And that would be a long discussion trying to decipher the camshaft itself, but this is the one that I picked. Let's go over some small block Dodge theory. The 5.2 liter 318, the bore is 3.91 and the stroke is 3.31. The 5.6 liter 340, the bore is 4.04 and the stroke is 3.31. So that is the same stroke as the 318. The 5.9 liter 360, the bore is 4 inches and the stroke is 3.58. So all the connecting rods have the same length for all 3 engines, which is 6.123. Both the Magnum 318 and 360 have 1.6 rocker ratio. They have the same combustion chamber size in the heads. I get different numbers, but it's supposed to be around 62 cc's. They're supposed to have the same combustion ratio, which is 9.1 to 1. And there is varied information on the Magnum combustion chamber size and combustion ratio, despite the fact that most agree the head is 62 cc's and compression ratio is 9.1 to 1. This may be because of the varied numbers for the block height. So the block height for the 318 is supposed to be 9.585 and 9.58 or 9.59 for the 360. So there's some different conflicting information there. Some people say that both the blocks have the same block height. So I guess what I'm saying is you need to kind of measure what you have and what you're working with. This leads to comments like the real factory compression ratio is ran in the 8s and as low as 7s in old 318s with the low compression height pistons. Magnums average 8.8 to 9.3, and it all depends on how deep in the hole the pistons are. There's anywhere from 0.040 to 0.080, and mine was around 0.050, so that's 50 thou in the hole. So an example would be a 1971 318 deck height at 9.6, and this is the center line of the crank to the top of the block, and that's where you get your 9.6 from. And you add the height of the stroke, the rod, and the piston to subtract from the block deck height. Here we have an example of that calculation. So you've got your piston compression height. Now for the pistons that I chose for this engine here, my number was 1.810, but in this case we got 1.741. So you take that number, and then you've got your rod length, and then you take your stroke, half of your stroke, and then you add all that up, and this is what you're going to get for total. And so then our deck height for the block is supposed to be 9.6, and then here's our total there, right? So we're going to subtract that, and that's going to tell us that we're 81 thou in the hole. So the point I'm trying to get across here is basically in my case, my piston's pretty much zero decked. It's flush with the top of the block here. And what we're talking about with those varying different numbers of compression ratios, and the reason why they're different is they didn't have consistency, or it varied too much between how deep down the piston was in the bore, right? So if you've got a piston that's 80 thou down there, you're going to lose a lot of compression. If you got a piston that's 50 thou down there, you're going to get more compression, but it's still not going to be great. So that was one of the big factors, was I wanted to increase my compression by raising this piston closer to the deck height. And then when you get here to your timing chain and you're lining up your marks, so you've got this mark here, and you've got this mark here, and so that's got us timed at top dead center on number 1 piston, and we're right at the top here. By comparison, this represents 80 thou down in the bore there, and I'm just using the vernier here to show that. So this space here, that's 80 thou. That's the distance from the top of the block to how deep the piston is in the bore there.